The hum of my tires on the eastbound lane of Interstate Bay Mui was supposed to be the only sound that morning. I had the heater running on low, fighting off the crisp March chill of the Colorado air, sipping lukewarm black coffee from a travel mug. My 8-year-old grandson, Owen, was sitting in the passenger seat. He loved riding shotgun, usually chattering a mile a minute about Minecraft or whatever new dinosaur he'd read about. But today, he was quiet. Too quiet. He was picking relentlessly at a loose thread on his jeans, his small shoulders hunched inward. I thought he was just sad because we had just dropped his Aunt Rebecca, my daughter, off at Denver International Airport for a week-long business trip to Chicago. I didn't know it yet, but that quietness wasn't sadness. It was pure, unadulterated terror. We were about 20 minutes from my house in the Denver suburbs when Owen suddenly reached across the center console. His small hand grabbed the sleeve of my flannel shirt with a grip so tight I felt his fingernails dig into my forearm. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly it cracked. "We can't go home." I glanced over, chuckling softly, thinking he just wanted to stop for donuts or drag out our morning drive. "What do you mean, buddy? You've got school, and I've got a garden that isn't going to weed itself." Owen didn't smile. He swallowed hard, his face pale, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. "I heard Mom and Dad last night, after you went to bed. They were talking about the special people coming today, at 3 o'clock. My foot eased off the accelerator. Special people? Mom said the neighbor saw you talking to yourself by the garage. She told Dad it was perfect proof. She said the special people from the hospital are going to take you to a home for crazy people today. And once you're locked inside, you won't be able to stop them from taking your house." A tear finally spilled over, tracking down his cheek. "Grandpa, please don't take us back there. I don't want them to take you away." The world outside the windshield seemed to stop spinning. The blood in my veins turned to ice water, and a sickening, hollow drop echoed in my stomach. I pulled my old Subaru out back onto the shoulder of the highway, the gravel crunching violently under the tires, and slammed the car into park. My hands were shaking, but my mind, honed by 35 years of sitting in courtrooms as a stenographer, snapped into a cold, terrifying focus. "My name is Lawrence Wright. I am 67 years old. I live in a beautiful 3-story house on Fairfax Street that I bought free and clear back in Mutngin with my late wife, Sarah. For over 3 decades, I made my living documenting every single word, every stutter, every lie, and every confession in the Denver court systems. When you spend that much time typing out the darkest parts of human nature, you learn how to read the subtle tells of a liar. You learn how a con artist breathes, how a thief shifts their weight, how a betrayer avoids eye contact. I just never thought I'd need those skills to survive my own flesh and blood. I looked at Owen, really looked at him. As a former court official, I've heard thousands of testimonies. I know the distinct, shaky cadence of a witness telling a terrifying truth. Owen wasn't making this up. He was a child repeating a nightmare he didn't fully comprehend, but one he knew was profoundly evil. "Owen," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady and low, masking the absolute hurricane of panic and rage swirling inside me. "I need you to tell me exactly what your mother said. Word for word. Can you do that for me?" He sniffled, rubbing his nose. Dad was pacing. He sounded scared about money. Mom told him to stop whining. She said, "The old man is sitting on nearly $1 million in assets and letting it rot. Dr. Ramirez signed the papers. The van comes at 3. By dinner time, we'll have power of attorney." Power of attorney. The legal terminology coming out of an 8-year-old's mouth was the final nail in the coffin of my denial. My son, Marcus, and my daughter-in-law, Danielle, were plotting to steal my life. Marcus is 38, a financial consultant who always wears suits that cost a little too much and drives cars he leases but pretends to own. Over the last few months, I'd noticed the late-night pacing, the hushed, frantic phone calls, the smell of cheap scotch seeping from his pores in the mornings. He was drowning in debt. And Danielle. Danielle is 36, a psychiatric nurse at Denver Health. Polished, cold, calculating. She looked at my house not as a home but as a real estate appraisal. Suddenly, the last 6 months of my life flashed before my eyes, reframed by a horrifying new context. What I had thought were simple senior moments were carefully orchestrated acts of psychological warfare. Like 3 weeks ago, when I couldn't find my daily heart medication, I panicked, tearing my bathroom apart, only for Danielle to find it tucked behind the milk in the refrigerator. She had looked at me with this cloying fake pity. "Oh, Lawrence, you're getting so forgetful. Maybe it's time we talk to a doctor." Or last week, when the front right burner of the gas stove was left completely open, filling the kitchen with an invisible, toxic hazard. Marcus had rushed in, aggressively shutting it off, and shouting at me for trying to blow the house up. I had sworn up and down I hadn't even cooked that morning. They looked at each other with feigned devastation. They were gaslighting me, building a narrative, creating a fake medical history of dementia and incompetence so that when the psychiatric transport team arrived, no one would question it. And Danielle, with her connections as a psych nurse, had found a dirty doctor to sign off on an involuntary mental health hold. "What time is it now?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Owen checked the digital clock on the dashboard. 11:47. 3 hours and 13 minutes until they dragged me out of my own home in a straitjacket. Marcus and Danielle thought I'd be gone longer. The airport round trip usually took me a couple of hours, plus I usually stopped for a diner breakfast. They were counting on me walking through the front door right into their trap, completely blind. "Okay, Owen, listen to me very carefully," I said, reaching over to squeeze his shoulder reassuringly. "You are a very brave boy. You did exactly the right thing telling me this. But right now, we are in a dangerous situation, and I need you to be my partner. Can you do that?" He nodded fiercely, a glimmer of relief washing over his terrified face. Relief that I believed him. Relief that the adults were finally taking charge. "We are not going home," I promised him. "We are going to go visit Mr. Chen next door. We're going to sit in his backyard shed, and we are going to watch our driveway. If you're right, well, your grandfather used to document evidence for a living. I'm going to do what I do best." I merged back onto the highway, the tires spinning with a newfound urgency. Every paternal instinct I had ever harbored for Marcus, the memories of teaching him to ride a bike, paying for his college so he'd graduate debt-free, wiping his tears when he scraped his knee, evaporated in the span of a 10-minute drive. He wasn't my son anymore. He was a predator. And I was the prey he had severely underestimated. I bypassed my street entirely, taking the back alleyway behind our suburban block. I parked my Subaru 2 streets down, behind an abandoned foreclosure, so it wouldn't be visible from my house. Owen and I walked the rest of the way in silence, slipping through the gap in the wooden fence of my neighbor's yard. David Chen was a 70-year-old retired postal worker, whose true passion in life was his tomato garden. He was out there in his straw hat, pruning leaves. "Lawrence," he called out, looking surprised as Owen and I emerged from the alley. "Didn't expect to see you creeping through the back." "Morning, David." I forced a casual, neighborly smile. "Listen, I need a massive favor. I've got some surprise contractors showing up to look at the foundation of my house, and it's going to be incredibly loud and dusty. Owen's mom isn't picking him up until later. Do you mind if we hang out in your gardening shed for a few hours? Keep the boy out of the mess?" David, bless his heart, didn't ask a single probing question. "Sure thing." Shed's unlocked. Grab the lawn chairs in the back. The shed was dimly lit, smelling of potting soil and old gasoline. But most importantly, it had a small, grime-covered window that perfectly overlooked my driveway. The view was partially obscured by a lilac bush, but it provided a direct line of sight to my front door. I set up the 2 lawn chairs. Owen sat beside me, his knees pulled up to his chest. I pulled out my smartphone, checked the battery 89%, and opened the camera app. And then, we waited. The silence in the shed was deafening. Every passing car made my heart hammer against my ribs. I spent the time mentally cataloging my assets, the house, the retirement fund, the specific education trust I had set up for Owen and Rebecca's kids, nearly $1 million of a lifetime of hard work, thriftiness, and sacrifice. All of it, about to be legally hijacked by the boy I raised. At high, 4:07 p.m., my watch beeped softly. Owen gasped, his little hand shooting out to point at the grimy window. "Grandpa, look." Turning onto Fairfax Street was a large, unmarked black Ford Transit van. It crawled down the asphalt like a hearse. As it pulled into my driveway, the sunlight caught the stark white lettering on the side panel, Rocky Mountain Behavioral Health Services. My blood ran utterly cold. Up until this exact second, a microscopic, naive part of my soul had hoped Owen had misunderstood, hoped this was a horrible nightmare. I raised my phone. I zoomed in. I snapped a photo of the license plate, Colorado JKL. Bongen by Chumhaimwichin. I captured the logo. I captured the timestamp. The doors of the van opened. Two massive men wearing white orderly uniforms stepped out. They looked less like medical professionals and more like nightclub bouncers. They were followed by a stern-looking woman holding a digital tablet. Then, my front door swung open. Out stepped Marcus, my son. He was wearing his expensive weekend clothes, checking his gold watch, his face a mask of irritated impatience. Danielle stepped out behind him, still wearing her pristine blue hospital scrubs, looking like the picture-perfect, concerned daughter-in-law. I pressed record on my phone, capturing the video of my own child coordinating my kidnapping. I couldn't hear their words through the glass, but I didn't need to. I watched Marcus gesture aggressively toward the empty street, clearly furious that I hadn't returned from the airport yet. I watched Danielle placate the woman with the tablet, pointing to her own scrubs, undoubtedly using her credentials to beg them to wait. They wanted to play a legal game of chess with a man who had spent 35 years studying the board. They wanted to steal my life and lock me away in a padded room to rot. Sitting in the shadows of that dusty shed, watching my son sell my freedom, a dark, unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't just survival instinct anymore, it was vengeance. I lowered my phone. "You want to take my life, Marcus?" I thought to myself. "Let's see how you like it when I take yours." The black van idled in my driveway for what felt like an eternity. From the dusty confines of Mr. Chen's gardening shed, Owen and I watched the tense standoff unfold. Even through the grimy window pane, I could see the furious flush creeping up Marcus's neck. He was pacing, gesturing wildly down the street, as if his sheer willpower could materialize my car out of thin air. The woman with the tablet from the psychiatric facility kept shaking her head, clearly explaining they couldn't wait forever. I didn't know it yet, but the frantic urgency in Marcus's posture wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was about something much darker, a desperate ticking clock that I was completely blind to. Danielle stepped forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand on the orderly's arm, offering one of her practiced, syrupy smiles. I couldn't hear her, but I knew exactly what she was doing. She was using her credentials as a psychiatric nurse to buy time, probably feeding them more lies about my dangerous delusions to keep them on the hook. But whatever she said, it wasn't enough. After 10 grueling minutes, the woman tapped her tablet decisively. The two massive orderlies climbed back into the van. Marcus threw his hands up in a theatrical display of rage, his face twisted into an ugly snarl that looked entirely foreign to me. Was this really the boy I had raised? The van backed out, its reverse lights flashing red, and disappeared down the suburban street. Owen let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. His little body slumped against my side, his fingers still clutching my shirt. "I was right, wasn't I, Grandpa?" "Yes, buddy," I whispered, pulling him into a tight hug, resting my chin on the top of his head. "You were absolutely right. You saved me today." We stayed hidden in that shed until Numba, Bamui PM. The air grew cold and stiff, but I didn't dare move until I was sure the coast was clear. I needed to give Marcus and Danielle enough time to stew in their failed plot, to let their guard down. When we finally slipped back through the fence to my hidden Subaru, I didn't drive us straight home. Instead, I took Owen across town to a classic retro diner we used to visit when Sarah, my late wife, was still alive. Sitting across from my grandson in a vinyl booth, watching him slowly eat a hot fudge sundae, the sheer gravity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. Owen looked so small. He was a normal 8-year-old kid who should have been worrying about math, homework, and cartoons, but instead, he was carrying the traumatizing weight of his parents' profound evil. If they were capable of orchestrating the kidnapping and institutionalization of their own father, what psychological damage were they inflicting on this boy? I realized then that this wasn't just a fight for my assets or my freedom, it was a rescue mission. I had to protect Owen. By the time I finally pulled my Subaru into my driveway, it was 6:45. The sun had dipped below the Rockies, casting long, sharp shadows across the lawn. I turned the key in the ignition, killing the engine, and took a deep, steadying breath. What happened next would require the performance of a lifetime. "Listen to me, Owen," I said, turning to him. "When we walk through that door, you go straight upstairs to your room. Put on your headphones, play your video games, and do not come out until I tell you. I'm going to handle your parents. Do you understand?" He nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt. The fear in his eyes was a stark reminder of what was at stake. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, stepping into the foyer with my keys jingling normally in my hand. The house was dead quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, I heard the rapid, heavy footsteps coming from the kitchen. Danielle appeared in the hallway first, still wearing her scrubs. She had arranged her features into a flawless mask of frantic worry, but her eyes, cold and calculating, didn't match the expression. "Lawrence, where on earth have you been? We were worried sick." Marcus stepped out right behind her. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "I called you a dozen times, Dad. Your phone went straight to voicemail." "Oh, did it?" I pulled my phone from my pocket, feigning innocent surprise. "Must have left it on silent after I dropped Rebecca off at the airport. Owen and I just lost track of time. We went for a long drive up into the foothills, grabbed some diner food. It was a beautiful day." I set my keys on the console table and met Danielle's gaze steadily. I looked for any trace of guilt, any flicker of shame for what she had tried to do to me just hours ago. There was nothing, just the predatory frustration of a trap that had sprung empty. "You should let us know when you're going to disappear for hours," Danielle snapped, her fake concern slipping just a fraction to reveal the venom underneath. "Especially at your age, Lawrence. You've been so forgetful lately. It's not safe." "At my age?" I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, losing its warm, grandfatherly tone. I stepped toward her, and for the first time, she actually flinched back. "I can take a drive without reporting to my children. I am 67 years old, Danielle. I am not 97, and I am certainly not incompetent." The word hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. Incompetent, the exact legal threshold they needed to cross to steal my life. Marcus blinked, stepping slightly in front of his wife. "Dad, nobody said you were incompetent. We're just trying to look out for you. You've been acting strangely." "I feel perfectly fine, Marcus," I said, my voice deadpan. "In fact, I've never felt sharper. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some files to organize." I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked steadily up the carpeted stairs. I could feel their eyes boring into my spine, practically burning a hole through my flannel shirt. They were confused. The easy target they thought they were managing had just pushed back. Once I was inside my third-floor office, I locked the heavy oak door behind me. My hands, which had been perfectly steady downstairs, finally began to shake. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a cold, hollow grief. I walked over to my desk and picked up a silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of Sarah and me, standing with a teenage Marcus on his high school graduation day. Before the cancer took her 8 years ago, Sarah had held my hand in the hospital bed and made me promise to take care of our boy. "He's smart, Lawrence, but he always looks for the shortcut. Keep him grounded," she had whispered. I thought I had, when he borrowed my car at 16 and returned it 3 hours late with an empty tank, having secretly driven to Boulder to see a girl. I hadn't grounded him. I had sat him down, played the understanding father, and talked to him about trust and accountability. He had looked at me with those earnest teenage eyes and promised he understood. Looking back now, I realized I hadn't taught him a lesson at all. I had taught him that his actions had no real consequences. I had enabled the exact entitlement that was now standing in my hallway, plotting my demise. And then he married Danielle. She was the match to his gasoline. She took his arrogant laziness and weaponized it into cold, calculated greed. I set the photograph face down on the desk. Sentimentality was a weakness I could no longer afford. I wasn't an understanding father anymore. I was a retired court stenographer, and it was time to go to work. I opened my laptop and immediately downloaded the photos of the psychiatric van, creating 3 separate encrypted folders backed up to different cloud servers. Then, I walked over to the vintage filing cabinet in the corner of my office. I unlocked the bottom drawer, pushing past old tax returns and property deeds, until my hands found the heavy, black Pelican case at the very back. I set the case on my desk and popped the latches. Inside, resting in custom-cut foam, was my old Steno-Mask digital recording suite. To the average person, it looked like a mess of wires and black plastic, but to me, it was the ultimate weapon. In the courtroom, stenographers are essentially ghosts. People forget you are there. But you hear everything. Every whispered threat between co-defendants, every panicked lie an attorney feeds their client. I had spent decades documenting the verbal mistakes that sent men to federal prison. This specific recording unit was top of the line. It was designed to record continuously for 72 hours, stamping every audio file with an encrypted date, time, and location tag. In the eyes of the law, files produced by this machine when properly logged were considered ironclad, admissible evidence. They carried an unbreakable chain of custody. My son wanted to play legal games with fake medical reports and forged signatures. He had no idea he was stepping into an arena with the man who literally wrote the transcripts. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously prepping the equipment. I had 3 wireless, battery-operated microphones, each no bigger than a quarter. They were designed to pick up whispers in a crowded courtroom. Waiting until I heard the shower running in Marcus and Danielle's en-suite bathroom downstairs, I slipped out of my office like a shadow. The first microphone went into the living room. I tucked it deep inside the speaker grill of an antique radio that sat on the bookshelf. Danielle hated the ugly wooden thing, but Marcus insisted on keeping it because it gave the room a vintage aesthetic. The irony of his pretentiousness, hiding his downfall, was almost sweet. The second microphone went into the kitchen. I slid it behind the refrigerator, attaching it to the wall via a small magnetic clip just above the ventilation grate. The acoustics of the tile floor would carry their voices perfectly. The third went right into my own office, buried inside the hollowed-out spine of a thick, fake legal encyclopedia on my bookshelf. I wired the receiver to my laptop, routing the audio directly into my encrypted drive, and plugged in my professional-grade, noise-canceling headphones. I tested the feeds. The audio was crystal clear. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could hear the faint sound of the water shutting off in the master bathroom below. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the pulsing green bars on my computer screen. I was ready. I was going to document my own son's betrayal, word by word, lie by lie, until the weight of the evidence was enough to bury them both under the jail. I didn't expect to catch anything major on the very first night. I figured they'd be cautious after the botched pickup attempt, maybe lick their wounds and wait a few days to regroup. But I was wrong. The digital clock on my desk ticked over to muy bon PM. The house was pitch black. Owen was fast asleep down the hall. I was just about to take my headphones off and get some rest when the green audio bars for the living room microphone suddenly spiked. I pressed the headphones tighter to my ears, my breath catching in my throat. I heard the clinking of ice against glass. Someone was pouring a drink. And then, the very first words out of my daughter-in-law's mouth made the blood freeze in my veins all over again. The green audio bars on my laptop screen violently spiked, illuminating my dark office with an eerie, rhythmic glow. I pressed the noise-canceling headphones tighter against my ears, my breath catching in my throat as the sharp, unmistakable sound of ice clinking in a glass echoed through the feed. Someone had just poured a drink in the living room downstairs. And then, the very first words out of my daughter-in-law's mouth made the blood freeze in my veins all over again. "Stop pacing, Marcus. You're giving me a headache." Danielle's voice hissed through the microphone, crystal clear and dripping with absolute disdain. The first attempt failed because he wasn't home. That's a logistical error, not a defeat. We simply try again. "A logistical error," Marcus shot back, his voice trembling with a frantic, high-pitched panic that I hadn't heard since he was a teenager caught in a lie. "Danielle, the transport team left if they flag my father's file or if the neighbors start asking questions." "Nobody is going to ask questions," she interrupted smoothly, the ice in her glass clinking again. "Dr. Ramirez owes me a massive favor. Do you remember that patient complaint last year? The medication mismanagement that almost cost him his license. I made that file disappear. He knows if he doesn't sign the incapacity documents, I'll suddenly remember exactly where I misfiled it. He'll authorize the Emote emergency mental health hold, no questions asked." I sat paralyzed in my leather chair. And Mote hold in Colorado is a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric commitment. It's a mechanism designed to save people who are in imminent danger to themselves. Danielle was going to weaponize it to legally kidnap me. "And then what?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "Then we file for emergency guardianship while he's locked in the ward," Danielle said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing grocery lists. "Once the court appoints us as guardians, we control everything. The Fairfax house, his retirement accounts, even the education trust he set up for Owen, all of it. He'll fight it. He'll hire a lawyer the second they let him out," Marcus argued. I leaned closer to the screen. my fingers hovering over my keyboard. I didn't know it yet, but Marcus's next sentence was about to escalate this from a sick family betrayal into a federal crime. Your father won't be able to hire a lawyer if we freeze his accounts first. Danielle replied with a dark, chilling laugh. What about the money, Marcus? Have you secured the credit line? A heavy sigh echoed through the microphone. I filed the home equity line of credit application at Wells Fargo yesterday. I took an old copy of his tax return from his filing cabinet, scanned it, and isolated his signature, cleaned it up in Photoshop, and printed it directly onto the bank forms. $85,000 should be enough to start. My hands dropped from the keyboard. Forgery, bank fraud, criminal impersonation. My son was casually confessing to a string of Class Num felonies. Perfect, Danielle murmured. That will buy us enough time to stop your margin calls and keep your precious financial planner license clean. By the time the old man figures out what's happening, he'll be heavily sedated in a long-term care facility, and we will have full power of attorney. He's been sitting on nearly $1 million in assets and just letting it rot. We deserve this, Marcus. We've put up with him long enough. I didn't stop listening, but my hands moved purely on muscle memory. 35 years of court reporting took over. I pulled up my transcription software and began typing. Timestamp, hi muy hi, muy bye. Speaker, Marcus Wright. Location, living room. Every pause, every inflection, every terrifying confession, I documented it all. By the time they went up to bed at midnight, I had 4 pages of legally admissible, time-stamped transcripts proving a conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse and wire fraud. But evidence alone wasn't enough to survive what was coming. I knew the law, but knowing the law and surviving your own family were 2 very different things. They had an aggressive timeline, and the hardest part of my counterattack wasn't going to be the legal strategy. It was going to be breakfast. The next morning, I woke up at my usual Bamui a.m. I made the coffee, fetched the newspaper from the driveway, and sat at the kitchen island, forcing my face into a mask of relaxed, elderly contentment. Marcus and Danielle surfaced around 7, dragging themselves into the kitchen to prepare for work. I could feel their eyes on me. The psychological warfare resumed immediately. Morning, Dad, Marcus said, not meeting my gaze as he poured a cup of coffee. He looked exhausted, the bags under his eyes dark and heavy. Did you sleep okay? You were tossing and turning a lot. I heard you muttering to yourself in the hallway around Ba'am. I hadn't left my bed since midnight. They were planting seeds again, building their fake narrative. Slept like a log, actually, I replied mildly, taking a sip of my coffee. I turned a page of the newspaper. Though I suppose my joints are acting up a bit. The cold air, you know. Danielle swooped in, placing a fresh stack of mail on the counter. Right on top was a glossy brochure for a high-end assisted living facility in Boulder. Just something to look at, Lawrence. For the future. We just want you to be safe. She leaned in, her voice dripping with that cloying fake sympathy. Oh, by the way, I couldn't find your reading glasses again. I eventually found them in the refrigerator, next to the butter. You really need to be more careful. I looked at her. I knew exactly where my glasses were. They were in my breast pocket, where I always kept them. She was blatantly lying to my face to make me doubt my own sanity. I had seen this textbook gaslighting in dozens of domestic abuse cases during my time in the courts. Silly me, I chuckled, tapping my temple. Getting old, I guess. Thank you, Danielle. She exchanged a satisfied, victorious look with Marcus. They thought I was a senile old fool, falling right into their trap, but beneath my calm exterior, a cold, calculating fury was brewing. Every lie she told, every fake concern Marcus voiced, was another nail I was going to hammer into their eventual prison cells. Owen shuffled into the kitchen a few minutes later, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked at me, then at his parents, his young eyes darting nervously. I gave him a subtle, reassuring wink. His posture relaxed infinitesimally. He was my anchor in this madness, and I had to keep playing the part of the oblivious grandfather to protect him from the crossfire. Later that afternoon, while the house was empty, I made my next move. I needed external verification. I needed a professional who could weaponize the evidence I was collecting without tipping off the police just yet if I went to the cops now. Marcus would just claim he was exploring legal financial options, and Danielle would say the audio was taken out of context. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. Gerald Hoffman, A gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Gerald, it's Lawrence Wright, Denver Superior Court, Department Bone." A booming laugh echoed through the speaker. "Larry, good Lord, it's been a minute. What's a retired stenographer doing calling a retired detective? Don't tell me you're finally ready to hit the golf course." Gerald had been a homicide detective with the Denver PD for 25 years before opening his own private investigation firm. He was sharp, relentless, and owed me a favor for a transcript error I had caught for him a decade ago that saved one of his cases. "No golf today, Gerald," I said, my voice dropping. "I need to hire you, officially, and I need it kept entirely off the books for now." The joviality vanished from his voice instantly. Cop mode engaged. "Where and when?" "Washington Park. Tomorrow, at 10, by the boathouse." The next morning, I told Marcus and Danielle I was going for a long walk around the park to get some fresh air. "Don't overexert yourself, Dad," Marcus had warned, his voice thick with that fake, grating concern. "Maybe stick to the paved paths. We wouldn't want you to wander off and get lost." "I'm not the one who's lost, Marcus," I thought as I drove away. I found Gerald exactly where we had agreed, sitting on a green park bench near the lake, tossing breadcrumbs to a flock of aggressive mallards. He wore a faded Rockies baseball cap and aviator sunglasses. We looked like two harmless retirees killing a Tuesday morning. I sat down next to him, didn't say a word, and simply handed him a thick manila envelope. Gerald opened it. Inside were the printed photographs of the Rocky Mountain Behavioral Health van, the license plate zoom-ins, and the 4 pages of transcribed audio from the night before. He read through the transcript in total silence. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. For a man who had investigated murders for a living, it took a lot to shock Gerald. But reading a son's cold-blooded plot to destroy his own father clearly struck a nerve. "Jesus Christ, Larry," Gerald breathed, lowering the papers. He took off his sunglasses and looked at me, his eyes hard. "This is a Class B felony conspiracy. Elder financial abuse, forgery, medical fraud. They're trying to financially execute you." "I know," I said quietly. "I need you to verify the bank fraud. I need you to quietly check with Wells Fargo about that $85,000 home equity application. If we can prove Marcus submitted it with a forged signature, we have him dead to rights." Gerald nodded slowly, slipping the envelope inside his jacket. "I've still got a guy in the fraud department over there. I can pull the application discreetly. What about this psych nurse daughter-in-law and this Dr. Ramirez?" "I need to know everything about Ramirez," I replied. Danielle claimed she made a malpractice complaint disappear for him. If we can find out what that complaint was, we can establish the quid pro quo she's using to extort him for the Umode hold. "Give me 48 hours, Gerald said, standing up. He dusted the breadcrumbs off his jeans. "But Larry, you need to watch your six. If your son's margin calls are due soon, he's a desperate man cornered by a lot of debt. If they figure out you're onto them, they won't wait for a medical transport van. Desperate people do desperate things." "I'll be careful," I promised. But I didn't know how right Gerald was until that very night. Around remote, home PM, I was in my office downloading the daily audio feeds. The house was quiet. I thought they were both asleep. But then, the kitchen microphone picked up the sound of a chair scraping against the tile. I put my headphones on. It was Danielle. She was on her cell phone, and she was speaking in a hushed, furious whisper to someone who definitely wasn't my son. "I don't care what Ramirez said. You need to push him," she hissed into the phone. "Marcus is dragging his feet, and the bank is taking too long to process the credit line. We can't wait for a natural decline anymore. I'm moving up the timeline." There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. "Yes, I have it," Danielle replied, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadened calm. "I brought home 2 vials of liquid lorazepam from the ward today. I'm going to start slipping it into his morning coffee. By Friday, he'll be so heavily sedated and confused he won't even know his own name. When the paramedics arrive this time, they won't need a fake evaluation to take him away. They'll carry him out on a stretcher." My blood ran utterly cold. I stopped breathing. They weren't just playing legal games anymore. My daughter-in-law was preparing to actively drug me. Liquid lorazepam, a potent, fast-acting benzodiazepine used to treat severe anxiety and, in high clinical doses, to heavily sedate aggressive psychiatric patients. In the wrong hands, it's a chemical straitjacket. I sat completely frozen in my dark office. the green audio bars on my laptop screen continuing to pulse as Danielle moved around the kitchen downstairs. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack my sternum. We had crossed a terrifying, invisible line. This was no longer just elder financial abuse or a fraudulent legal maneuver. This was physical assault. This was poisoning. I didn't sleep a single second that night. I sat in my leather chair, staring at the wall, running through permutations of survival. I couldn't just stop drinking my morning coffee. Danielle was a trained nurse, and any sudden deviation in my routine would make her suspicious. If she realized I was onto them, there was no telling what a desperate cornered animal might do. No, I had to drink the coffee, or, at least, I had to make her believe I drank it. And more importantly, I had to give her exactly the reaction she was looking for. I was going to have to fake my own mental collapse. Thursday morning broke with a gray, overcast chill. At come a.m., I walked down the stairs, making sure my steps were deliberately a fraction slower than usual. As I entered the kitchen, the smell of dark roast coffee filled the air. Danielle was standing by the island, wearing her scrubs, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She looked up and smiled a bright, warm, utterly lethal smile. "Good morning, Lawrence. I already poured your coffee. It's right there next to the paper." "Thank you, Danielle," I said, my voice perfectly steady. I walked over to my usual stool. A steaming ceramic mug sat waiting for me. I looked down into the dark liquid. It looked completely normal. It smelled completely normal. But I knew that somewhere in that dark brew, a heavy dose of hospital-grade tranquilizer was waiting to shut my brain down. I needed a distraction, and I needed it fast. "Oh, shoot," I muttered, patting my pockets. "I think I left my reading glasses on the side table in the living room. Danielle, sweetheart, would you mind grabbing them for me? My knees are just killing me today." She hesitated for a split second, her eyes darting to the coffee mug, then back to me. "Of course, Lawrence. I'll be right back." The moment her back turned and she rounded the corner into the living room, I moved with a speed that would have shocked her. I grabbed the heavy ceramic mug, stepped quietly to the sink, and dumped the entire contents down the drain, running the hot water for exactly 2 seconds to wash away the evidence. I left just enough brown residue at the bottom to make it look empty. I set the mug back on the coaster and sat down, just as I heard her footsteps returning. "I couldn't find them," she said, sounding slightly annoyed. "That's because they're right here on my collar," I chuckled softly, tapping the frames hanging from my shirt. Silly me. Losing my mind, I swear. Danielle's eyes locked onto the empty coffee mug. A flicker of profound, dark satisfaction passed over her face. "Drink it fast this morning, didn't you?" "It was delicious," I said, giving her a gentle, oblivious smile. Now, the real performance had to begin. Lorazepam takes about 20 to 30 minutes to kick in on an empty stomach. I retreated to my office, setting a timer on my watch. When the alarm softly vibrated on my wrist 30 minutes later, I walked back out into the upstairs hallway. Marcus was coming out of his bedroom, adjusting his tie for work. I waited until he was looking at me, then I deliberately let my left foot drag on the carpet. I stumbled, catching myself heavily against the wall. I let my eyelids droop, forcing a vacant, glassy stare into my eyes. "Dad?" Marcus asked, stopping in his tracks. He didn't rush forward to help me. He just watched, his posture rigid with anticipation. "Marcus," I slurred my words, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. I feel very strange. The hallway it's spinning a little bit." "You're just tired, Dad," Marcus said, his voice dropping into that fake, soothing tone. He stepped closer, peering into my eyes. He was looking for dilated pupils, for the sluggish response of a heavily sedated man. I blinked slowly, heavily, acting as though staying awake required immense physical effort. "Maybe you should go lay down," he suggested, placing a hand on my shoulder. His grip wasn't comforting, it was assessing. "You don't look well at all." "I think I will," I mumbled, leaning heavily against the wall as I shuffled back into my office. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the lethargy vanished. I stood perfectly straight, my heart pounding with adrenaline. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it. But I couldn't celebrate yet, because my burner phone, a cheap prepaid device I had bought just for this situation, began to vibrate in my desk drawer. It was Gerald. I answered immediately, keeping my voice to a whisper. "Tell me you have good news." "I have news, Larry, but none of it is good." Gerald's gritty voice crackled over the line. I pulled strings at Wells Fargo. The $85,000 home equity application is real, and the signature is definitely a digital forgery. I've got a contact in their fraud department putting a quiet freeze on it as we speak. But Larry, I did a deep dive into Marcus's financial firm. I found out why he's so desperate. I gripped the edge of my desk. I thought it was margin calls, bad investments. It's worse, Gerald said, and the grim tone in his voice made the hair on my arms stand up. Marcus didn't just lose his own money. He lost a client's money. An elderly widow named Mrs. Higgins. He embezzled $200,000 from her portfolio to cover his own bad crypto bets. And Larry, the firm's compliance department scheduled a surprise internal audit for this coming Monday. If Marcus doesn't replace that money by Monday morning, he's not just facing bankruptcy. He's facing 10 to 15 years in federal prison. The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. My son wasn't just a greedy opportunist. He was a desperate criminal backed into a lethal corner. The fake home equity loan was just a band-aid, a desperate attempt to buy time. He needed my entire estate, and he needed it now. They're not going to wait for the 72-hour psychiatric hold, Gerald. I realized, the horrifying truth washing over me. If they get me committed today, Danielle will use her hospital connections to declare me legally incompetent by the weekend. They'll drain my accounts before Monday. You need to get out of that house, Larry, Gerald warned. Go to the police right now. No, I said, my voice hardening into steel. If I go to the police now, they'll claim I'm a confused old man, reacting to a misunderstanding. I need to sever their legal access to me completely so they have nothing left to fight for. I'm going to see Patricia. Patricia Chen was an absolute shark. I had found her through my old courthouse connections, a high-powered attorney specializing in elder law, asset protection, and estate fraud. At Moat, home PM, while Marcus was at his firm and Danielle was supposedly at her clinic, I slipped out the back door, walked 3 blocks to my hidden Subaru, and drove straight to her downtown Denver office. I sat across from her massive glass desk, laying out the transcribed audio, the photos of the van, and the horrifying revelation of the lorazepam. Patricia, a sharp-featured woman in her late 40s who wore a charcoal suit like a suit of armor, didn't flinch. She just started writing furiously on a yellow legal pad. We need to build a fortress around you immediately, Mr. Wright. First, I am drafting an irrevocable living trust. We are transferring the deed to your house, your retirement accounts, and Owen's education fund directly into it. I will be the co-trustee alongside your daughter, Rebecca. Once you sign this, Marcus and Danielle cannot touch a single dime of your money, even if they somehow miraculously get a judge to grant them guardianship. How fast can you draft it? I asked. I'll have it ready for signature by tomorrow morning. We'll video record the signing to prove competency, she replied smoothly. But to make it utterly bulletproof against Danielle's fake medical claims, you need an independent forensic psychiatric evaluation. Today, right now. She handed me a business card. Dr. Martin Foster. He's a court-appointed forensic psychiatrist. I already called him and pulled a massive favor. He's waiting for you. I drove straight to Dr. Foster's office. For 3 grueling hours, I sat in a sterile room while a man with wire-rimmed glasses put my brain through a psychological obstacle course. He tested my short-term memory, my pattern recognition, my spatial awareness, and my emotional stability. He asked me to draw clocks, recite strings of numbers backwards, and analyze complex legal hypotheticals. When it was over, Dr. Foster set his pen down and looked at me with profound respect. Mr. Wright, your cognitive function is exceptional. You scored a perfect 30 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination. There is absolutely zero evidence of dementia, psychosis, paranoia, or cognitive decline. I am printing a 12-page, legally certified report stating you are entirely competent to manage your own affairs. I held that thick manila folder against my chest like a shield. I had the legal documentation. I had the transcripts. Tomorrow, I would have the irrevocable trust. The trap was fully constructed. I just needed the rats to step on the trigger. I drove back to Fairfax Street, arriving just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and black. I parked down the street and approached my house from the alleyway, slipping through Mr. Chen's yard. But as I neared my back patio, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back door was slightly ajar. I crept onto the porch, pressing my back against the siding. The house was unnervingly silent. No television, no sounds of dinner being prepped. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness. Then, I heard it. A soft, muffled sobbing coming from the second floor. It was Owen. I pushed the door open, abandoning my stealth, and stepped into the kitchen. My foot crunched on something hard. I looked down. It was my favorite ceramic coffee mug, the one I had supposedly drank from that morning, shattered into dozens of pieces on the tile floor. "Owen," I called out, my voice echoing up the stairwell. "Grandpa," his terrified voice shrieked from upstairs. "Grandpa, help me, the door is locked." I took the stairs 2 at a time, my 67-year-old knees screaming in protest, but adrenaline fueled my ascent. I reached the landing and found Owen's bedroom door shut tight. I grabbed the handle. It was locked from the outside. I unlocked it and shoved it open. Owen launched himself into my arms, burying his tear-streaked face into my chest, trembling violently. "Where are they?" I demanded, holding him tight, scanning the empty hallway. "They left," Owen sobbed, clinging to my shirt. "Mom came home early. She checked your office and started screaming when you weren't there. Then Dad came home, and they were yelling about money and audits. Mom locked me in here," she said. "She said if you weren't in the house, she couldn't prove you were crazy, so she had to make you look crazy out there." My stomach plummeted. "What did she do, Owen?" "She took your extra clothes, Grandpa, the ones from the laundry room, and your old wallet with your expired ID. Owen looked up at me, his eyes wide with horror. "She told Dad they were going to plant your things by the river downtown and call the police. She's going to tell them you wandered off in a lorazepam-induced psychotic break." I stood up, pulling Owen with me. Danielle wasn't just trying to commit me anymore. By planting my clothes by the river and claiming I was heavily sedated and confused, she was setting the stage for a tragic, accidental drowning. They were upgrading from elder abuse to murder. And then, piercing through the quiet suburban evening, I heard the wail of approaching sirens, but they weren't far away. They were turning onto Fairfax Street. Through the front window, flashing red and blue lights began to bounce violently against the living room walls. The police weren't at the river. They were right outside my front door. The pounding on my front door was so violent it rattled the frosted glass panes in the foyer. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers sliced through the darkness of my living room, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I held Owen tightly against my chest, feeling his small heart hammering like a trapped bird. Danielle hadn't just planned to plant my clothes by the river. She had called Chinchamuy Moat to set the stage. I didn't know exactly what lie she had spun to the dispatcher, but I knew I had exactly 30 seconds to control the narrative before armed officers kicked my door off its hinges. "Owen, look at me," I whispered, my voice steady, projecting a calm I absolutely did not feel. "I need you to go into my master bathroom, lock the door. Sit in the empty bathtub and put your headphones on. Do not come out until I say the magic word, courthouse. Do you understand?" He nodded, tears streaking his pale cheeks, and scrambled down the hallway. I waited until I heard the heavy click of the bathroom lock. Then, I smoothed down my flannel shirt, took a deep breath, and walked down the stairs. 35 years of sitting in criminal courtrooms had taught me one universal, life-saving truth. Police officers are trained to mirror the energy they encounter. If you meet them with panic, they escalate. If you meet them with calm, documented authority, you short-circuit their threat response. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the front door open. 2 Denver PD officers stood on my porch, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. One was a stocky veteran in his 50s, the other a younger Hispanic officer whose eyes darted past me, scanning the interior for a threat. "Lawrence Wright?" the older officer asked, his voice sharp and commanding. "I'm Officer Johnson. This is Officer Martinez. Sir, we need you to step out onto the porch slowly and keep your hands where we can see them." I complied immediately, stepping into the crisp evening air, keeping my hands open and relaxed at my sides. "Good evening, officers. How can I help you?" Officer Martinez frowned, clearly confused by my calm demeanor. "Sir, we received a frantic Chinchamuy call from your daughter-in-law. She reported that you had stolen a highly potent psychiatric medication from her medical bag, consumed it, and were experiencing a violent, suicidal psychotic break. She said you locked your grandson in a room and were trying to harm yourself." The sheer audacity of the lie almost took my breath away. She was projecting her own crime onto me to justify an emergency police extraction. If I had been even slightly agitated, if I had shouted, or panicked, or tried to angrily defend myself, they would have cuffed me, thrown me in the back of a cruiser, and hauled me to a psychiatric ward under an involuntary mental health hold. Danielle would have won without ever getting her hands dirty. But I wasn't an agitated, senile old man. Officers, I understand why you're here, and I appreciate your prompt response, I said, my voice dropping into the measured, professional cadence I used when reading transcripts back to a judge. However, my daughter-in-law is lying. She filed a false police report to facilitate a fraudulent involuntary commitment. I am a retired official of the Denver Superior Court. I am completely lucid, completely sober, and I have evidence to prove she is attempting to steal my estate. Johnson narrowed his eyes. Sir, that's a very serious allegation. We still need to clear the house and call for paramedics to check your vitals. You are welcome to clear the house, I replied smoothly, stepping aside. But before you call the paramedics, I highly recommend you look at the document sitting on my foyer table. Martinez stepped inside cautiously while Johnson kept his eyes on me. A moment later, Martinez returned, holding the thick manila folder I had brought back from Dr. Foster's office just hours ago. What is this? Johnson asked. That is a 12-page, legally certified, independent forensic psychiatric evaluation, I explained, watching their expressions shift from suspicion to genuine shock. It was conducted at 1 o'clock this afternoon by Dr. So. Martin Foster, a court-appointed psychiatrist you are likely familiar with. It proves I have perfect cognitive function. I also have time-stamped audio recordings of my son and daughter-in-law conspiring to forge my signature on an $85,000 bank loan and plotting to drug me with liquid lorazepam to force and moat psychiatric hold. The two officers stared at me, then down at the pristine psychiatric evaluation, then back at me. The narrative Danielle had meticulously built was crumbling right in front of them. Mr. Wright, Officer Martinez said slowly, his hand dropping away from his belt. If what you're saying is true, your family is committing multiple felonies. I am acutely aware, I said grimly, and I know where they are right now. They are downtown, planting my spare clothes near the Platte River to claim I wandered off and drowned, just in case this police visit didn't end with me in a straitjacket. Johnson pulled his radio off his shoulder. I'm calling this in to the detectives. We can have units at the river and arrest them tonight. No, I interjected sharply. Not yet. Johnson paused, his thumb hovering over the mic. Excuse me? If you arrest them tonight for a false police report, they will hire a lawyer and claim it was a terrible misunderstanding, I explained, my mind working 10 steps ahead. My son is facing a federal audit on Monday for embezzling $200,000 from a client. He is desperate. I have an attorney finalizing an irrevocable living trust tomorrow morning that will legally lock them out of every dime I own. When they realize the money is gone, they are going to make one final, undeniable attempt to force me into a medical transport van. I want to catch them in the act, with the fraudulent paperwork in their hands. I want an airtight conspiracy charge. The two officers exchanged a long, hard look. They were cops. They hated being lied to. And Danielle had just used Chinchumwe as a weapon. They wanted her just as badly as I did. I'll speak to our captain, Johnson finally said, his tone shifting from authoritative to conspiratorial. If we're going to set up a sting, we need to coordinate with your attorney. In the meantime, you and the boy cannot stay here tonight. It's not safe. I nodded. We won't. 10 minutes later, the cruisers pulled away, their lights extinguished. I retrieved a trembling Owen from the bathroom, packed a small overnight bag, and drove us to a Marriott hotel on the other side of town. I paid in cash so the transaction wouldn't alert Marcus if he was monitoring my accounts. Sitting in the dim light of the hotel room, watching Owen finally fall asleep, watching cartoons, the magnitude of what was happening settled heavily on my shoulders. I was a 67-year-old widower, sleeping in a cheap hotel, preparing to orchestrate the federal arrest of my only son. The grief threatened to swallow me whole, but I forced it down. Grief was for later. Tomorrow was for war. Friday morning arrived with blinding, harsh sunlight. I dropped Owen off at school, giving his principal a strict list of instructions that under no circumstances were his parents allowed to pick him up. Then, I drove downtown to Patricia Chen's high-rise office. When I walked into the conference room, Patricia wasn't alone. Gerald Hoffman was leaning against the window, looking grim. And sitting at the polished mahogany table, looking completely bewildered, was my daughter, Rebecca. I had called her at Come a.m. and told her to get on the first flight out of Chicago. "Dad." Rebecca jumped up, hugging me tightly. "You scared me to death. What is going on? Why did you need me here so urgently?" I sat her down. For the next 30 minutes, I didn't sugarcoat a single detail. I played the audio of Marcus confessing to the bank fraud. I played the audio of Danielle planning to poison my coffee. I watched my daughter's face cycle through confusion, utter disbelief, and finally, a devastating, heartbroken rage. "He's my brother," she whispered, her voice breaking, staring blindly at the transcripts on the table. "I knew he was bad with money, but this, Dad, they were going to kill you. They were going to try," I corrected her gently, squeezing her hand. "But they failed, and now we are taking away their reason for trying." Patricia stepped forward, placing a thick stack of legal documents on the table. "Rebecca, your father is establishing an irrevocable living trust. It protects the Fairfax house, his entire retirement portfolio, and the education fund for your children and Owen. It totals nearly $1 million. We are naming you and myself as the sole co-trustees. The second your father signs these papers, Marcus loses any and all legal standing to contest his estate." A notary public was brought into the room, along with a video camera on a tripod. I sat tall, looked directly into the lens, and stated my name, the date, and my clear, voluntary intent to protect my assets from my son. I signed every page. The notary stamped them. It was done. The money they had sacrificed their souls for was officially, legally gone. "All right," Gerald said, stepping away from the window, his cop instincts kicking into high gear. "The legal shield is up. Now we drop the hammer. I just got off the phone with Officer Johnson from last night. They ran the plates on the black psychiatric van from the photographs. It belongs to Rocky Mountain Behavioral Health. And guess who just filed a mandatory transport request for 3 o'clock this afternoon?" My jaw tightened. "Danielle." "Exactly," Gerald nodded. "Marcus's audit is Monday. He needs you out of the way before the banks close for the weekend. They're bringing Dr. Ramirez with them to sign the pros and hold in person, right in your living room, claiming you're in immediate danger to yourself based on Danielle's fake police report from last night." Patricia closed her briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap. "This is it, Lawrence. The sting. If we let them attempt the transport, we catch Ramirez practicing fraudulent medicine, Danielle falsifying medical records, and Marcus committing conspiracy to kidnap. But you have to be the bait. You have to be in the house." "I'll be there," I said, a cold determination settling into my bones. "Officer Johnson and a team of plainclothes detectives will be parked in an unmarked van down the street," Gerald instructed, handing me a small, black panic button. "Keep this in your pocket. Do not press it until they physically attempt to restrain you or produce the fraudulent paperwork. We need them fully committed to the crime." Rebecca hugged me, tears streaming down her face. "Please be careful, Dad. They have nothing left to lose." "Neither do I, sweetheart," I replied. By high. Home p.m. I was back inside the Fairfax house. The silence was deafening. I sat at my desk in the third-floor office, staring at the steno mask recorder, watching the green bars pulse in the quiet room. I had placed the 12-page psychiatric evaluation in a manila folder on my desk, right next to the printed transcripts of their crimes. At exactly high, Bonmuilam p.m., I heard the front door unlock downstairs. Heavy, frantic footsteps echoed in the foyer. Marcus and Danielle were home. I didn't move. I just listened through my headphones as they rushed through the kitchen. "Is he here?" Marcus hissed, his voice tight with panic. "His car is parked down the street," Danielle replied. "He has to be upstairs. Listen to me, Marcus. The van is 3 minutes away. Do not lose your nerve now. Ramirez is going to ask if he's been violent. You tell him yes. You tell him he threatened you with a kitchen knife. Understand?" "I understand," Marcus breathed heavily. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my shirt, feeling the small plastic panic button in my pocket. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Outside my window, the low, unmistakable rumble of a diesel engine echoed down the street. The black van was pulling into my driveway. The low rumble of the diesel engine outside my window sounded like a judge's gavel coming down on my life. From my third-floor office, I listened to the heavy, synchronized thud of van doors slamming shut. Then came the squeak of rubber-soled shoes marching up my concrete driveway. It was a terrifying, mechanical sound. These weren't medical professionals coming to care for a patient. They were a cleanup crew coming to dispose of an obstacle. I stood behind my heavy oak desk, my hand resting casually in my pocket, my thumb hovering over the cold, hard plastic of the panic button Gerald had given me. Downstairs, the front door burst open. Danielle's voice immediately echoed up the stairwell, and her performance was nothing short of Oscar-worthy. She was practically hyperventilating, her words choked with perfectly manufactured sobs. "He's upstairs, doctor. Oh God, it's been a nightmare. He's completely detached from reality." He took the lorazepam and then started screaming about conspiracies. He cornered me in the kitchen with a carving knife before locking himself in his office. "It's going to be all right, Danielle," a smooth, arrogant male voice replied. "Dr. Carlos Ramirez. We deal with violent psychotic breaks every day. Stand back and let my men handle this." Heavy boots began to ascend the stairs. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. Every paternal instinct I had ever possessed, the instinct to protect my home, to nurture my family, was finally, permanently extinguished. My son was walking up those stairs to execute me financially and mentally. I didn't know how thoroughly a human heart could break until my office door swung open. Two massive men in white orderly uniforms stepped into the room. They looked less like nurses and more like bouncers at a mob-run nightclub. One of them was holding a heavy leather restraint belt. The other held a medical kit. Behind them stood Dr. Ramirez. He was in his early 40s, wearing a crisp white lab coat over a tailored suit, holding a clipboard like a shield, and hovering right over his shoulder was Marcus. My son looked terrible. The stress of his impending federal audit had physically hollowed him out. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and clammy, a sheen of terrified sweat coating his forehead. He needed my estate, and he needed it before the banks closed for the weekend. "Lawrence Wright?" Dr. Ramirez asked, stepping forward with a patronizing, artificially gentle smile. He spoke to me slowly, the way one might speak to a confused toddler. "I'm Dr. Ramirez. Your family is very worried about you. We understand you've had a difficult few days. We're going to take you to a nice, quiet facility where we can help you feel better." I didn't react to the provocation. I kept my voice perfectly level, falling back into the cold, clinical rhythm of the courtroom. "Doctor, I am perfectly fine. I am lucid, I am sober, and I respectfully decline your medical services." Ramirez sighed, a theatrical display of patience. He glanced back at Marcus, then looked at me, his eyes hardening. "Mr. Wright, you are experiencing paranoid delusions. You consumed a dangerous amount of unprescribed psychiatric medication, and you threatened your daughter-in-law with a deadly weapon. You are an imminent danger to yourself and others." I needed him to commit to the fraud on the audio feed. I needed the final nail in his medical license. "Is that your official medical opinion, Dr. Ramirez?" I asked calmly. "Are you authorizing an involuntary mental health hold based entirely on the hearsay of my daughter-in-law without conducting a single independent psychological evaluation of your own? Because you and I both know you owe her for covering up your malpractice complaint last year." Ramirez actually flinched. The color drained from his arrogant face for a fraction of a second, but his ego quickly overrode his caution. He squared his shoulders. "Your medical history of rapid cognitive decline has been thoroughly documented by a licensed psychiatric nurse," Ramirez snapped, his professional facade cracking to reveal the corrupt extortionist beneath. "I have the legal authority to commit you, Mr. Wright. Now you can walk to the van voluntarily, or my men will sedate you and carry you out. The choice is yours." The orderly with the medical kit stepped forward, pulling a syringe from the sterile wrapping. I looked past Ramirez and locked eyes with my son. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball. The boy whose college tuition I had paid. The man who was now holding his breath, waiting for the needle to go into my arm. "Marcus," I said quietly, the heavy silence in the room amplifying my voice. "I know about the $200,000 you embezzled from Mrs. Higgins. I know about the surprise compliance audit on Monday morning. If you let them put that needle in me, there is no coming back from this. Is this really how you want to do this, son?" Marcus's entire body went rigid, his jaw dropped, and a look of sheer, unadulterated terror flooded his eyes. How could his senile, confused father possibly know about his highly classified corporate embezzlement? For a second, I saw him waver. I saw the sheer weight of reality threaten to break his resolve. But then, Danielle pushed past him, stepping into the doorway. Her fake tears were gone, replaced by a vicious, cornered snarl. "He's hallucinating again, doctor. He's making up names and numbers. Just sedate him. Do it now." "Hold his arms," Ramirez ordered the two massive men. The orderlies lunged toward my desk. My thumb clamped down on the black panic button in my pocket. I pressed it so hard the plastic nearly cracked. "I wouldn't take another step," I barked, my voice booming with such sudden authoritative ferocity that both orderlies froze mid-stride. I pulled my hand out of my pocket and slammed the thick manila folder onto my desk. "Because if you lay a single finger on me, it is felony assault. And the officers coming up the stairs are not going to be nearly as polite as I am." "What officers?" Danielle spat, looking frantically over her shoulder. "There are no officers." She was wrong. Downstairs, the front door didn't just open, it was breached. A thunderous crash echoed through the house, followed instantly by the heavy, chaotic stomping of multiple combat boots rushing into the foyer. "Denver Police, nobody move, show me your hands." The commanding roar of Officer Johnson tore through the house. Marcus let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward into the hallway just as Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez crested the top of the stairs, their service weapons drawn and held at the low ready. Right behind them was Gerald, looking every bit the seasoned detective, holding his badge up. "Hands where I can see them, now!" Martinez shouted, leveling his gaze at the two orderlies. The syringe dropped from the orderly's hand, clattering against the hardwood floor. Both men threw their hands into the air, their faces pale with shock. Ramirez practically dropped his clipboard, his arrogant posture dissolving into instant, trembling panic. "Officers, thank God you're here," Danielle shrieked, pivoting flawlessly back into her victim role. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "He's having a violent episode. He threatened us." "Shut your mouth, Mrs. Wright," Officer Johnson interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal, icy calm. He holstered his weapon but kept his hand resting on the grip. "We've been sitting in an unmarked van down the street for the last hour. We know exactly what's going on here." I stepped out from behind my desk, picking up the manila folder. I didn't look at my son. I looked directly at the corrupt doctor who had tried to steal my life. "Dr. Ramirez," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden, tense silence of the room. "What you just signed is a fraudulent mode emergency hold. You conspired to commit false imprisonment and medical fraud. And you did it right in front of the 3 hidden court-admissible microphones I installed in this room, which are currently recording directly to an encrypted cloud server." Ramirez's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the doorframe to keep from collapsing, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for the hidden cameras he suddenly realized were documenting his ruin. "You're insane," Marcus choked out, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and unfocused. "You're crazy. None of this is real. You don't have microphones. You don't have proof. You're incompetent." "Actually, Marcus, he's incredibly competent." A sharp, feminine voice rang out from the stairwell. Patricia Chen, dressed in a flawless charcoal suit, stepped gracefully onto the landing, clutching a leather briefcase. And right behind her, stepping into the light of the hallway, was my daughter, Rebecca. When Marcus saw his sister, the last shred of color drained from his face. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the lever get pulled. "Rebecca," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" "Watching you destroy yourself," Rebecca said, her voice shaking with a disgust so profound it seemed to suck the air out of the room. "You make me sick, Marcus. You tried to kill our father for money." "I didn't," Marcus pleaded, turning frantically to the police, then back to Patricia. "He's confused. We're just trying to protect his assets." "Your father's assets are perfectly safe, Mr. Wright," Patricia said, stepping into the office and laying a thick, legally bound document on my desk. She looked at Marcus with the cold, predatory gaze of a shark smelling blood in the water. "As of 10 o'clock this morning, your father signed an irrevocable living trust. Every single dollar, including the deed to this house, has been legally transferred. He no longer owns the assets you are trying to steal. The trust owns them. And the sole trustees are myself and your sister." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was absolute, suffocating dead air. I watched the realization hit Marcus in real time. The psychological collapse was instantaneous. Without my estate, he couldn't cover the $200,000 embezzlement. Without the money by Monday morning, the federal auditors would flag his accounts. He wasn't just broke, he was going to federal prison. No, Marcus breathed, his hands sinking into his hair, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated panic. No, 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 you can't do that. Dad, you can't. Monday. I need it by Monday. They're going to audit me. They're going to do a lot more than audit you, Marcus, Gerald said quietly from the doorway. I forwarded my investigation to the SEC and the FBI this morning. They're already at your firm. A high-pitched, hysterical noise tore out of Danielle's throat. She backed away from Marcus, her eyes wide with terror, as the reality of the situation finally pierced her arrogant delusion. The entire conspiracy was unraveling in spectacular fashion. The police were here, the FBI was at the firm, the money was gone, the audio was recorded. I had nothing to do with the embezzlement, Danielle suddenly screamed, pointing frantically at her husband, throwing him under the bus without a second of hesitation. It was his idea. He forged the bank documents. I was just trying to get Lawrence medical help. Marcus snapped his head toward his wife, his expression twisting from terror into a primal, betrayed rage. You lying bitch, you brought the lorazepam. You called Ramirez. Enough, Officer Johnson barked, stepping between them. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot. Marcus Wright, Danielle Wright, Dr. Carlos Ramirez, you are all under arrest. But Marcus wasn't listening. His mind had completely snapped under the weight of his impending doom. The millions he thought he was owed, the pristine life he thought he was stealing, had just turned into a locked cage. He let out a guttural, animalistic roar, lowering his shoulder, and lunged directly past Officer Martinez. He wasn't aiming for the door. He was aiming straight for me. I'll kill you, Marcus screamed, his hands outstretched, his face contorted into a mask of absolute homicidal madness. What happened next changed everything. Marcus didn't even make it halfway across the room. For all his unhinged, screaming fury, my son was a financial planner who spent his days sitting behind a desk, shouting at spreadsheets. He was no match for a 20-year veteran of the Denver Police Department. Officer Johnson didn't even bother to draw his weapon. He simply stepped off the landing, planted his boots, and intercepted Marcus with a brutal, practiced efficiency. Johnson caught Marcus by the lapels of his expensive suit, used my son's own forward momentum against him, and slammed him face first onto the surface of my heavy oak desk. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. My steno mask equipment, the very machine that had documented his ruin, clattered to the floor, along with a cascade of pens and paperclips. Marcus let out a breathless, agonizing wheeze as the wind was entirely knocked out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to thrash or swing, Officer Martinez was there, grabbing Marcus's left arm and twisting it sharply behind his back. The harsh, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed in the sudden silence of the office. Resisting arrest, attempted assault on a police officer, attempted assault on an elderly person, Officer Johnson listed off the new charges, his voice devoid of any emotion, his knee pressed firmly into the small of Marcus's back. Keep fighting, Marcus, please. I've got a whole book of charges I'd love to throw at you today. Marcus didn't keep fighting. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic, sobbing shell of a man who had finally hit rock bottom. He lay pinned against my desk, a thin trail of blood trickling from his split lip, crying so hard his entire body convulsed. I looked down at him, searching my soul for a flicker of paternal instinct, a shred of the unconditional love that is supposed to bind a father to his son. I waited for the heartbreak to wash over me, for the desperate urge to tell the officers to stop, to make a deal, to save my boy. But I felt absolutely nothing. The space inside my chest where my love for him used to live was just a cold, hollow cavern. The man bleeding on my desk wasn't the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. That boy had died a long time ago, replaced by a greedy, entitled predator who saw my life as nothing more than an ATM. Danielle was backed into the corner near the bookshelf, her hands raised, trembling so violently she looked like she might vibrate out of her own skin. Her flawless, country club composure had entirely disintegrated. "I'm a nurse," she shrieked hysterically as Gerald Hoffman stepped toward her, pulling a pair of zip-tie cuffs from his jacket pocket. "You can't do this. I am a licensed medical professional. He manipulated me. Marcus forced me to do it, I swear to God." "Save it for the judge, Mrs. Wright," Gerald said, spinning her around and securing her wrists tight. "The medical board is going to love hearing how you steal hospital-grade lorazepam to poison your father-in-law." By the door, Dr. Ramirez had sunk to his knees entirely of his own volition. The arrogant, untouchable psychiatrist was weeping into his hands, the clipboard with the fraudulent, moat-hold paperwork lying discarded on the carpet beside him. He didn't need to be tackled. He knew exactly what this meant. His medical license, his practice, his freedom, it was all gone in the span of 60 seconds. "Get them out of my house," I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady. Officer Johnson hauled Marcus to his feet. My son's face was a mask of snot, blood, and tears. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, begging for a lifeline that no longer existed. "Dad, please," Marcus choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, I'm your son. Don't let them do this. I'll fix it. I'll pay the money back. Just tell them it was a mistake. You stopped being my son the moment you decided my freedom was worth less than your crypto debts," I replied, holding his gaze without blinking. "You made your bed, Marcus. Now lie in it." The perp walk down my driveway was a spectacle I will never forget as long as I live. I followed the officers down the stairs, standing on my front porch beside Rebecca and Patricia as the police marched the 3 conspirators out into the fading afternoon light. The flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers illuminated the manicured lawns of Fairfax Street, drawing out the neighbors like moths to a flame. David Chen was standing by the gap in his wooden fence, his pruning shears completely forgotten in his hand, his jaw practically resting on the grass. Other neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, pulling aside curtains, watching in stunned silence as the wealthy, successful Marcus Wright and his perfect, polished wife were shoved into the back of separate police cruisers. The 2 massive orderlies from the psychiatric van were lined up against the side of their own vehicle, being patted down by additional uniformed officers who had arrived on the scene. As Officer Martinez pressed a hand to the top of Danielle's head to guide her into the back of the squad car, she twisted around, locking eyes with me across the lawn. The sheer, unadulterated hatred burning in her gaze was chilling. She mouthed a promise I couldn't quite read, but the malice behind it was unmistakable. The cruiser doors slammed shut. The engines roared to life. And just like that, they were gone, escorted down the street in a parade of flashing lights, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. I stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the empty driveway. It was over. The trap had sprung. The threat was neutralized. "Dad!" Rebecca's soft voice broke through my thoughts. I turned to see my daughter wiping tears from her cheeks, stepping forward to wrap her arms around my waist. I hugged her back, resting my chin on top of her head, finally letting out a long, shuddering breath. "You're safe," she whispered against my shirt. "It's really over." "It's over," I agreed, though the exhaustion seeping into my bones made the victory feel incredibly heavy. We went back inside. The house felt entirely different now. It felt larger, emptier, as if a toxic, suffocating gas had finally been vented from the rooms. Patricia was at the dining room table, neatly packing her legal documents back into her briefcase. "The police will need you to come down to the precinct tomorrow to make an official, sworn statement," Patricia said, snapping the latches shut. "But with the audio recordings, the forged bank documents, and the fact that they brought a fraudulent doctor into your home, the district attorney isn't going to offer them much in the way of a plea deal. They're looking at 5 to 10 years, minimum." "What about Owen?" Rebecca asked, looking up at me, her maternal instincts kicking in. "Dad, they can't take him to foster care. He's just a little boy." "They won't," I assured her. "I'm going to petition for emergency physical custody tomorrow morning. Dr. Foster's evaluation proves I am more than capable of providing a stable home for him. He's safe at the hotel for now. I just need to figure out how to explain to an 8-year-old that his parents are never coming home." Gerald, who had stayed behind to help secure the house, walked into the dining room. He had his cell phone pressed tightly to his ear, his brow deeply furrowed. He was listening intently, nodding, his face draining of color with every passing second. I knew that look. I had seen that exact expression on the faces of homicide detectives standing over a fresh crime scene. "I understand. Flag it immediately. Call me back when the lab gives you a definitive breakdown," Gerald said, his voice completely devoid of its usual gruff warmth. He hung up the phone and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't look at Patricia, and he didn't look at Rebecca. He looked dead at me. "Larry," Gerald said softly, "I need you to sit down." My heart, which had finally started to slow its frantic rhythm, kicked back into high gear. "What is it, Gerald? Are they making bail? Did the DA kick back the charges?" No, they aren't getting out anytime soon, Gerald said, pulling a chair out from the dining table and gesturing for me to sit. When I refused to move, he let out a heavy sigh. The booking officers just completed the intake search of Danielle's belongings. They went through her purse, and they found the liquid lorazepam, I said, a wave of confusion washing over me. We already knew she had it. She was going to drug me this morning. They found the lorazepam, Gerald confirmed, taking a slow step toward me. But they found something else, tucked into a hidden zipper compartment at the bottom of her designer bag. They found a black leather binder. Inside the binder were 3 separate life insurance policies taken out on your life, Larry. I frowned, glancing at Patricia. Life insurance, but they wanted my estate. Marcus needed the $200,000 for his embezzlement cover-up. Life insurance takes weeks, sometimes months to pay out. That doesn't help his Monday morning audit. The policies weren't taken out by Marcus, Gerald said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. They were taken out by an LLC registered exclusively in Danielle's maiden name. 3 policies, totaling $2.5 million. And Larry, they were finalized and signed 3 months ago. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. 3 months ago. That was right around the time I started experiencing the senior moments. The time I couldn't remember where I put my keys. The time I experienced a sudden, terrifying bout of vertigo that sent me to the floor. The time my stomach cramped so violently I couldn't get out of bed for 2 days. I had blamed it on bad takeout and old age. Marcus and Danielle had used those moments to gaslight me, to build their narrative of my failing health. But a horrifying, dark realization began to claw its way up my throat. What else did they find in the purse, Gerald? I asked, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Gerald swallowed hard. They found a small, unmarked amber glass dropper bottle. The booking officer noticed it had a strange, metallic smell. They fast-tracked it to the crime lab upstairs. Larry. The preliminary test just came back positive. Positive for what? Rebecca asked, stepping closer to me, her eyes wide with fear. Thallium, Gerald said. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Thallium, a highly toxic heavy metal, odorless, colorless, tasteless, used decades ago as rat poison before it was banned. It was the perfect murder weapon for someone with access to secure hospital storage facilities. It builds up in the system over time. The symptoms of thallium poisoning: joint pain, vertigo, severe stomach cramps, confusion, memory loss, neurological degradation. Every single symptom of the dementia they were documenting. She wasn't just trying to drug you today to force a psychiatric hold, Gerald said. The sheer evil of the revelation chilling the room to absolute zero. The psychiatric hold was Marcus's desperate, last-minute pivot because he got caught embezzling. But Danielle has been playing a much longer, much darker game. She has been slowly, methodically poisoning your food for the last 3 months, Larry. She was going to murder you, let the coroner chalk it up to natural neurological failure in an elderly man, and walk away with $2.5 million entirely independent of Marcus. My knees finally gave out. I sank heavily into the dining room chair, staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. Danielle hadn't just been gaslighting me. She hadn't just been moving my reading glasses or turning on the gas stove to make me look crazy. She had been standing in my kitchen every single morning, smiling her warm, country club smile, slipping heavy metals into my morning coffee. She had been chemically eroding my brain, day by day, drop by drop. Oh my God, Rebecca sobbed, clapping her hands over her mouth, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. Dad, you've been eating her cooking. You drank the coffee. I need to get you to Denver Health immediately for a full toxicology screen, Patricia said, her professional armor cracking, her voice tight with genuine panic. If there are heavy metals in your system, we need to begin chelation therapy tonight before there is permanent organ damage. But I wasn't thinking about my organs. I wasn't thinking about the vertigo, or the brain fog, or the $2.5 million. My mind snapped violently to the Marriott Hotel across town, to the room where I had left my 8-year-old grandson watching cartoons on a king-sized bed. Owen, who sat at the kitchen island with me every single morning. Owen, who always asked for a sip of my coffee because he liked the sugar. Owen, who ate the exact same dinners Danielle prepared for the family every single night. Gerald, I whispered, the terror rising in my chest like a tidal wave, suffocating me, paralyzing my lungs. We have to get to the hotel. Right now. Larry, you need a hospital. I need my grandson. I roared, surging out of the chair, knocking it backward onto the hardwood floor. He eats off my plate, Gerald. He drinks from my cups. If she's been poisoning my food for 3 months. I didn't finish the sentence. I couldn't. I bolted for the front door. The victory of the afternoon entirely shattered, replaced by a nightmare far worse than any psychiatric ward. What happened next changed everything, because I didn't know if the boy who had saved my life was already dying from the inside out. The tires of Gerald's unmarked detective vehicle screamed against the asphalt as we tore out of my driveway, leaving the flashing lights of the crime scene in our rearview mirror. I was in the passenger seat, my hands gripping the dashboard so hard my knuckles were stark white. Rebecca was in the back, weeping silently into her hands. Patricia had stayed behind to secure the house and liaise with the district attorney, but my mind was entirely detached from the legal victory. The trust, the fraud, the psychiatric van, it all felt like meaningless background noise compared to the suffocating terror gripping my throat. Danielle had been feeding me thallium for 3 months, a heavy metal, rat poison. And my 8-year-old grandson, the boy who shared my breakfast every single morning, the boy who loved to sneak a sip of my sugary coffee before the school bus arrived, was alone in a hotel room. I didn't know it yet, but the race against time had already begun weeks ago. I just hadn't heard the starting pistol. We blew through 3 red lights on our way to the Marriott. Gerald flashed his badge through the windshield, his siren wailing a low, guttural warning to the evening traffic. When we finally slammed into the hotel's loading zone, I didn't even wait for the car to fully stop. I threw the door open, ignoring the sharp, protesting ache in my 67-year-old knees, and sprinted through the lobby. I took the stairs to the 2nd floor, my heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I practically ripped the keycard from my pocket, swiped it with shaking hands, and shoved the heavy door open. The room was bathed in the soft, flickering blue light of the television. Cartoons were playing silently. Owen was curled into a tight ball on the far side of the king-sized bed, sound asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The sheer wave of relief that washed over me was so powerful my legs nearly buckled. I rushed to the edge of the bed, dropping to my knees. "Owen," I whispered, reaching out to gently shake his small shoulder. "Buddy, wake up. It's Grandpa." He groaned, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, blinking sleepily against the light of the hallway spilling into the room. "Grandpa, is it over? Are the police gone?" "It's over, sweetheart," I said, my voice cracking. I pulled him into a desperate, crushing hug. "You're safe. I've got you." But as I pulled away to look at his face, my hand brushed against the pristine white pillowcase. My fingers caught on something. I looked down, and the blood instantly drained from my face, leaving behind a cold, horrifying certainty. Resting on the white cotton was a clump of fine, light brown hair. It wasn't just a few loose strands. It was a dense, alarming patch. Alopecia sudden, unexplained hair loss. It was one of the hallmark, textbook symptoms of prolonged heavy metal poisoning. "Grandpa?" Owen asked, his young brow furrowing as he saw the sheer terror in my eyes. He reached up, rubbing the back of his own head, his fingers coming away with another small clump of hair. He stared at it, his lower lip beginning to tremble. "Why is my hair falling out? My tummy hurts again. My tummy hurts again." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had thought he was just nervous. I had thought the stress of his parents' screaming matches was giving him anxiety aches. I was a fool. I had been living with a monster, and I had let her poison the only pure thing left in my life. "We have to go," I said, scooping his 80-pound frame into my arms without a second thought. "Rebecca, get the door." 10 minutes later, we were bursting through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room at Denver Health. It was a profound, bitter irony. This was the exact hospital where Danielle worked. This was the fortress she had used to build her fraudulent medical narrative against me. The place where she had manipulated Dr. Ramirez to sign the moat hold. Now, it was the only place that could save us. "I need a toxicologist immediately," I shouted at the triage desk, my voice echoing off the sterile tile walls. Nurses and orderlies turned their heads, alarmed by the frantic, breathless old man carrying a terrified child. A triage nurse stepped forward, her hands raised defensively. "Sir, you need to calm down. What is the emergency?" "My name is Lawrence Wright," I said, forcing my voice to drop into a lethal, commanding register. "My daughter-in-law is Danielle Wright. She is a psychiatric nurse at this hospital, and she was just arrested by the Denver Police Department for attempted murder. She has been poisoning our food with thallium for 3 months. My grandson is symptomatic. I am symptomatic. We need heavy metal panels and chelation therapy right now." The nurse's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. Danielle was well known here, the polished, perfect nurse who baked cookies for the break room. But the sight of Owen's pale face, clutching a handful of his own fallen hair, shattered any doubt. The emergency room exploded into action. Within minutes, Owen and I were separated into adjoining trauma bays. The sterile smell of iodine and bleach filled my nostrils as needles were slipped into my veins, drawing vial after vial of dark red blood. Doctors fired rapid questions at me about timelines, symptoms, and dietary habits. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her face a mask of absolute agony, watching her father and her nephew be treated like crime scenes. The wait for the rapid toxicology results was the longest, most agonizing hour of my entire life. I lay on the stiff hospital bed, staring at the fluorescent lights on the ceiling, the guilt eating me alive from the inside out. I had spent the last week feeling so incredibly smart. I had patted myself on the back for outwitting Marcus with hidden microphones and legal trusts. I thought I was playing a master game of chess. But while I was focused on the money, Danielle had been playing a completely different game. She didn't care about the irrevocable trust. She didn't care about the home equity line of credit. She was playing for blood. The door to my bay finally slid open. A senior toxicologist, a stern-looking woman named Dr. Aris, walked in holding a tablet. Her expression was grim. "Mr. Wright," she said quietly, pulling up a stool beside my bed. "The preliminary mass spectrometry confirms it. You have toxic levels of thallium in your bloodstream. It's consistent with chronic, low-dose exposure over a period of 10 to 12 weeks. The vertigo, the joint pain, the cognitive fog, you mentioned it wasn't dementia. It was your nervous system breaking down." "And Owen?" I asked, my voice barely a rasp. "Please, God, tell me about my grandson." Dr. Aris sighed, a heavy, empathetic sound. "Owen tested positive as well. However, his levels are significantly lower than yours. Given his body weight, he is symptomatic. The alopecia and gastrointestinal distress are clear indicators, but we caught it before it could cause permanent neurological or renal damage." I closed my eyes, a single, hot tear slipping down my cheek and soaking into the paper pillow cover. He was going to live. We were both going to live. "We are starting you both on a regimen of Prussian blue immediately," Dr. Aris continued, gesturing to a nurse who was already hanging an IV bag filled with a vibrant, dark blue fluid. "It's a specialized antidote that binds to the thallium isotopes in your digestive tract and pulls them out of your system. You will both be admitted to the toxicology ward for at least 5 days. But Mr. Wright, you are incredibly lucky. If she had administered the liquid lorazepam on top of your current thallium levels, your respiratory system would have collapsed entirely. You would have been dead before the ambulance arrived. She hadn't just been trying to sedate me for the psychiatric van. She had been trying to administer the kill shot. An hour later, as the blue antidote dripped slowly into my veins, they wheeled Owen's bed into my room so we wouldn't be separated. He was fast asleep, the exhaustion of the poison and the trauma finally pulling him under. Rebecca sat in a chair between our beds, holding my hand in a tight, unyielding grip. Just before midnight, the heavy wooden door to our private room pushed open. Gerald walked in. He looked 10 years older than he had this afternoon. His suit jacket was off, his tie loosened, and dark shadows clung to the hollows beneath his eyes. He had just come from the police precinct, where the district attorney was officially processing the conspirators. "How is he?" Gerald whispered, nodding toward Owen's sleeping form. "He's going to be okay," I replied, my voice raspy. "We both are. The Prussian blue is working." "What happened at the precinct, Gerald? Did Marcus know?" It was the question that had been torturing me for hours. Marcus was a greedy, entitled fraudster. He was willing to lock me in an asylum to steal my money. But was my son a murderer? Did he know his wife was sprinkling rat poison into our morning coffee while his own child sat at the table? Gerald pulled up a chair, resting his elbows on his knees. I interrogated Marcus myself. "Larry, when I laid the toxicology report on the table and told him his son was in the hospital being treated for heavy metal poisoning, he broke. And I don't mean he cried. I mean his mind completely shattered." Gerald shook his head, a grimace of pure disgust crossing his face. Marcus had absolutely no idea. He was hyper-fixated on the trust, the estate, and his embezzlement cover-up. He thought Danielle's plan was strictly limited to the fraudulent psychiatric hold. When he realized she was going to kill you and that she had accidentally poisoned Owen in the crossfire, he started screaming. It took 3 deputies to restrain him. He flipped on her entirely. He gave us every password, every timeline, every single detail of his own financial crimes, completely unconditionally, just to ensure she goes to prison for the rest of her life. Good, Rebecca spat viciously. Let them destroy each other. But that's not the worst of it, Larry, Gerald said, his voice dropping into a dark, terrifying register. He pulled a small black notebook from his shirt pocket and flipped it open. While Marcus was confessing, cybercrimes managed to crack the encrypted folder on Danielle's laptop. We found the life insurance policies, the ones taken out 3 months ago. The $2.5 million, I said tiredly. No, Gerald corrected, looking up at me, his eyes dead and cold. That was just the total for the 3 policies she took out on you. There was a 4th policy hidden in a subfolder. She didn't just insure your life, Larry. The steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor seemed to stutter. The room went perfectly, suffocatingly still. What are you saying, Gerald? I asked, the blood turning to ice in my veins. The 4th policy was for $500,000. Gerald read from his notebook, his voice tight with an anger. I had never heard from him before. And the insured party was Owen. Rebecca let out a muffled, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. I slowly turned my head, looking at my 8-year-old grandson, sleeping peacefully with an IV tube taped to his small arm. She wasn't accidentally poisoning him in the crossfire, Gerald whispered, snapping his notebook shut. She was dosing his food intentionally. The liquid lorazepam she brought home today. She brought 2 vials. Larry, 1 for you, and 1 for Owen. She was going to wipe out the entire bloodline tonight, collect $3 million, and claim that in your lorazepam-induced psychotic break, you murdered your grandson before dropping dead of a heart attack. I stared at the blue liquid dripping into my arm. I had spent 35 years documenting the darkest, most twisted depths of human depravity in the courtrooms of Denver. I thought I knew what evil looked like. I thought it was loud, violent, and chaotic. I didn't know it wore pristine scrubs, baked cookies for the hospital break room, and smiled at you while pouring your morning coffee. She's in holding cell block 4, Gerald said quietly, reading the dark, violent shift in my eyes. The DA is preparing capital murder charges by tomorrow morning. She's never seeing the light of day again, Larry. It's over. No, Gerald, I whispered, my voice devoid of any warmth, any mercy, or any humanity. I looked out the hospital window, into the pitch-black Denver night, the poison in my veins burning with a newfound, terrifying clarity. It's not over. Prison is too good for her. When this goes to trial, I'm going to take everything she has left. The recovery process was brutal, a grueling marathon of physical and psychological endurance. For 10 days, Owen and I lived in that sterile toxicology ward at Denver Health. I watched my grandson choke down pills and endure endless IV drips of Prussian blue, a medication that quite literally turned our bodily fluids the color of dark ink as it aggressively bonded to the thallium and flushed the poison from our organs. There were nights when Owen would wake up screaming, clutching his stomach, his small hands pulling loose more clumps of his light brown hair. I would sit on the edge of his hospital bed, rocking him back and forth, singing softly until the pain medication kicked in. In those dark, quiet hours, staring at the blue-tinted bags of fluid keeping us alive, my hatred for Danielle solidified into something cold, heavy, and unbreakable. But we survived. By the 2nd week of April, our blood panels were clear enough to go home. The house on Fairfax Street felt entirely different when we returned. Patricia and Gerald had hired a specialized hazmat crew to completely scour the kitchen, removing every trace of the contaminated food and liquids Danielle had hoarded. It was pristine, silent, and finally safe. Justice moved with a swift, merciless efficiency. Marcus never even made it to trial. Crushed by the overwhelming evidence of his federal embezzlement, the forged bank documents, and the horrifying reality of what his wife had done, his spirit completely shattered. He took a global plea deal. The last time I saw my son was through a thick pane of reinforced glass at the Arapahoe County Detention Center. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking 20 years older, his shoulders hunched in defeat. He picked up the heavy black receiver. His hand was trembling. "Dad, how's Owen?" "Owen's hair is growing back," I said, my voice flat, holding the receiver to my ear. His kidneys didn't sustain permanent damage. He's seeing a trauma therapist twice a week. Tears welled in Marcus's eyes, spilling over his hollow cheeks. I didn't know, Dad. I swear to God on my life, I didn't know she was poisoning him. Or you. I just wanted the trust money to cover the audit. I was stupid. I was so arrogant and stupid. You were, I agreed, feeling absolutely no urge to comfort him. But stupidity isn't what put you in that jumpsuit, Marcus. Greed did. Entitlement did. You opened the door to a monster because you thought you deserved my money more than I deserved my life. You brought her into my home. You made this possible. He pressed his forehead against the glass, sobbing quietly. I'm so sorry. I know you'll never forgive me. I wanted you to know. You're right, I said quietly, setting the receiver back on the cradle. I won't. I stood up and walked away, never looking back. Marcus was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He lost his license, his freedom, and his family. But Danielle's trial, that was the main event. 6 months after the poison was flushed from my veins, I found myself sitting in the front row of the Denver Superior Court. The very building where I had spent 35 years of my life typing transcripts was now the theater for my ultimate revenge. Danielle had pled not guilty. Her high-priced defense attorney, paid for by her wealthy, embarrassed parents, tried to paint her as a battered, manipulated wife. The defense's narrative was that Marcus was an abusive, controlling mastermind who had forced her to forge the medical documents and plant the poison. She sat at the defense table wearing a modest gray cardigan, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the victim with terrifying perfection. But then, the prosecution called their star witness. The courtroom doors opened, and Dr. Carlos Ramirez was led to the stand. He wasn't wearing his tailored suits anymore. He was in county jail scrubs, his arrogant posture entirely broken. He had cut a deal to avoid a life sentence, and what he was about to reveal sent a shockwave through the entire courtroom. I didn't know it yet, but Danielle's depravity went much deeper than simple greed. Dr. Ramirez, Prosecutor Stephanie Moore began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. Can you explain to the court the true nature of your relationship with the defendant, Danielle Wright? Danielle stiffened at the defense table. Her attorney immediately objected, but the judge overruled it. Ramirez swallowed hard, adjusting the microphone. He didn't look at Danielle. We were romantically involved. We had been carrying on an affair for over 2 years, using the on-call sleep rooms at Denver Health. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. I gripped the wooden railing in front of me, my knuckles turning white. She wasn't just poisoning us. She had been betraying Marcus long before the financial troubles began. And was this affair the real reason you agreed to sign the fraudulent, psychiatric hold on Lawrence Wright? Moore pressed. Yes, Ramirez admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But the psychiatric hold wasn't the original plan. It was a panicked audible. Marcus was breathing down her neck about his federal audit. He needed Lawrence committed immediately so he could access the estate. But Danielle had a different plan, didn't she? Moore asked, turning to the jury. She walked to the evidence table and held up a thick financial dossier. Dr. Ramirez, can you identify this document? It's a bank statement, Ramirez said, closing his eyes. From an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. It's a joint account in my name and Danielle's maiden name. An account that was opened 3 months ago, Moore clarified, her voice ringing with absolute, lethal authority. The exact same week Danielle purchased $3 million in life insurance on her father-in-law and her 8-year-old son. Tell the jury, Doctor, what was the endgame? Ramirez finally opened his eyes, and he looked directly at Danielle. The hatred between the two former lovers was palpable. The endgame was a clean sweep. Danielle was slowly poisoning Lawrence and Owen with thallium. But she wasn't going to wait for them to die naturally. Once they were weak enough, she was going to stage an accident. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I stopped breathing. She was going to use the liquid lorazepam. Ramirez confessed, the tears finally falling down his face. She was going to overdose the old man and the boy. And then, she was going to frame Marcus for the murders. The magnitude of the betrayal hit the room like a bomb. Marcus's fingerprints were all over the forged bank documents, Ramirez explained, his voice shaking. He was drowning in debt. He had motive. Danielle was going to plant the empty lorazepam vials in Marcus's briefcase. She was going to play the devastated, grieving widow whose desperate husband went insane and murdered his family for the inheritance. Marcus would take the fall and rot in prison. Danielle would collect the $3 million in life insurance, and she and I were going to move to the Caymans. Absolute, stunned silence. Danielle's mask finally, spectacularly slipped. The modest, weeping victim vanished, replaced by the cornered, vicious predator I had seen in my office. "You coward!" Danielle suddenly shrieked, lunging out of her chair, straining against her attorney who scrambled to hold her back. Her face was contorted in demonic rage, spit flying from her lips as she screamed at Ramirez on the stand. "We had a deal, you weak, pathetic coward. I did all the work." The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! Order in the court! Bailiffs, restrain the defendant!" As the bailiffs wrestled a screaming, thrashing Danielle back into her seat, I looked at the court reporter sitting just below the judge's bench. Her fingers were flying across the stenography machine, capturing every single word of Danielle's furious, unhinged confession. I leaned back against the hard wooden pew, a profound, bone-deep sense of closure finally washing over me. I had spent 35 years documenting the darkest parts of human nature. Today, I got to watch my own nightmare documented and sealed forever. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud, child abuse, resulting in serious bodily injury. The judge sentenced Danielle Wright to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. She would die in a concrete box, thousands of miles away from the Cayman Islands, stripped of her medical license, her freedom, and her humanity. 2 years later, the spring sun was shining brightly over Fairfax Street. I was sitting on the back patio, sipping a cup of hot black tea. I had never been able to drink coffee again after the hospital, watching my 10-year-old grandson chase Mr. Chen's golden retriever across the grass. Owen's hair had grown back thicker than before. The dark circles under his eyes were gone, replaced by the bright, energetic spark of a healthy, happy child. The legal proceedings to officially adopt him had been finalized a year ago. I wasn't just his grandfather anymore. In the eyes of the law, I was his father. My steno mask equipment was securely locked away in a trunk in the basement. I didn't need it anymore. The house was quiet, safe, and filled with a peace that we had fought tooth and nail to earn. There are people who will tell you that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that you must always forgive your own flesh and blood, no matter what they do. But I know the truth. I learned it sitting in courtrooms, and I learned it in my own home. Blood doesn't make you family. Love, loyalty, and protection make you family. Marcus and Danielle shared blood and legal ties with us, but they were predators. The real family was the 8-year-old boy who risked his own safety to whisper a warning to his grandfather in the front seat of a Subaru. I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warm Colorado breeze against my face. I survived the ultimate betrayal because I paid attention. I survived because I didn't let sentimentality blind me to the truth standing right in front of me. And most importantly, I survived because I remembered the greatest lesson a court of law can teach you. The truth doesn't care about your feelings. But if you document it, if you preserve it, and if you have the courage to face it, the truth will set you free.